Thank you for spending your Friday afternoon with us, and happy Friday to you. Again, I'm Joan Samuelson, and this is my good friend, Sampada Dalvi, and it's not on because I didn't push the gray button. Okay, and that's my first mistake today. And my two ladies are, thank you, Sam, my two ladies are Zora Neale Hurston. Most of you, even very well read, may not have read her, and I think everybody knows who Maya Angelou is, and even if not, we will. The reason why you may not, can you okay now? The reason why you may not have heard of Zora Neale Hurston before is because she was suppressed, like Charlotte Perkins Gilman and like Kate Chopin. These women's writings were suppressed by publishers and other resources over the 20s and 30s and 40s and on into the women's movement in 1970s. About the mid-70s, they were rediscovered, and this includes Zora, by the feminist press and various women's centers. I had been an English major for my whole life, and I had degrees from the University of Houston, and I'm at Ohio State, and somebody comes up to me in the library, somebody I know, a friend, and says, "Joan, have you ever read Zora Neale Hurston?" Who? Because I did not have any idea who she was talking about, because this writer was not in the Norton Anthology or any other anthology that I had read for all of these 2-degree programs and now halfway through a doctoral program. I didn't know it. She said, "You've got to read her." And the book was Their Eyes Were Watching God. Doesn't have much to do at all with God. It has everything to do with soul. And it was written by Zora Neale Hurston in the flush of her career. She was born in the South. She was raised in Florida. I can't go, of course, through everything about her, but she did get a college education. She made her way up to New York City. She worked with Frank Boas, if you Google him, very famous anthropologist. And this woman that we hadn't heard of in the 70s was in fact incredibly famous and incredibly popular in her day, the Harlem Renaissance during the 30s. And she was loved. And this novel I included in my women's studies course I worked for both the English department and the Women's Center at OSU, and I said, well, let me pop this book in here because I loved it and see what they think. And she's in there with Charlotte Bronte. She's in there with Jane Austen. She's in there with Virginia Woolf. Let's see if she can hold her own, this woman that I had never heard of, but I loved her book. At the end of this semester, and there were men and women in this course, men are wonderful women's studies students. At the end, we had a good time, we're having a party, and at the end I said, write me down on a piece of paper who your favorite author was this semester, and you know where I'm going with that. They were all classics, they were all brilliant. We knew we were going to enjoy them and learn a lot. None of us had heard of Zora Neale Hurston before. It was their favorite novel. It's one of the most beautiful love stories you would ever want to read. Janie, and his nickname is Tea Cake. And he's one of the great male figures of literature, one of the great lovers of literature, a man who knows how to treat a woman who has not been treated right in her entire life, created by Zora Neale Hurston. Huge success in her own time, huge success 50 years later in my class, and we had never heard of her. What happened? Her life fell apart, even though she was working very well with and closely with Frank Boas, and even though she was published. You can see the list here of short story writer and essayist, folklorist, etc. There's so much that she did. And she had worked very well with other writers and was publishing enormously through many different sources. Their Eyes Were Watching God was the pinnacle of her work, but also she had written essays, ethnographic works, etc. But something went wrong. The mistake that they felt she made, her compeers there who were also writers, very famous people, I'm not going to label anybody in this talk, but they started telling lies about her. They were jealous of her, and the lies tore her apart and tore her down. They were terrible lies and ruined her career, ruined her life, and ruined her forever. Zora Neale Hurston, this beautiful, beautiful woman. I love these pictures of her. She was always in a styling hat, and she was always laughing. These pictures are so beautiful, but she was betrayed. She ended up back in Florida, where she had grown up, destitute, poverty-stricken. And she ended up being a maid for a white family that hired her. Zora Neale Hurston, who is read all over the world today and loved and conducts her own success in classes and handling of her novels just as well as Bronte does, died at age 69 intestate with nothing in a home. Her family that she was taking care of apparently paid for that and paid for her burial in a pauper's cemetery. She was on the black side. It was segregated. She ended up in a segregated graveyard, and no one knew where her grave was. It was unmarked. So if you notice this at the bottom, it says Ms. Magazine, and it references Alice Walker. I can't actually do a whole lot of pointing right here, so I'm just pointing things out to you, and they're right up there. Alice Walker, you know, is the author of The Color Purple, and Sampada, Dr. Dalvi, will be talking about her. She's a favorite as well. And she was a very powerful figure with Ms. Magazine, which was a much stronger, more political, more powerful magazine in its own day in the 70s with the women's movement. And they paid Alice Walker. I said, let's go find out who this person is, because they were just discovering her. So they paid Alice Walker to go to Florida and try to find her and her grave, and nobody knew where her grave was. They said they thought it was somewhere in this cemetery over here with the blacks. So what she did was have a marker made, and she went over to that side of the cemetery, and she decided, I'm going to make this one Zora Neale's grave. It's unmarked. Nobody knows who's there. And so she put that headstone down there, and it says Zora Neale Hurston, a genius of the South. And she had been ignored for decades. What I want to do is take you to one of her works. I wouldn't have time to even summarize Their Eyes Were Watching God, but I strongly recommend you read it, because it's not just about a man and a woman who fall in love with one another. It's about people taking care of one another. And there's a reason why it's called Watching God. You have to get all the way to the end. They go through everything together, and Janie goes through everything together. And one of the things that Janie does go through is an abusive marriage before she meets Tea Cake. And that's my transition into this one. It seemed to be a theme of Zora's, and Zora was married a couple of times that we know of. I don't know of any children. This is a theme that seems to affect her a lot about abuse. So in this story, and it was too much to I try to print it out for you like the poem for the next writer, but it's short, it's 6 pages, and it's about Delia and Sykes Jones. And this is the 20s, right? It's right before the stock market crash. These people are desperately poor. And Delia, there are a lot of metaphors in here, a lot of symbols in here. Delia works as a washerwoman. And that had been the fate of an awful lot of black women all the way through slavery and on into the Harlem Renaissance and in the 20s and the 30s. And it was honest work, and they were washing clothes for white people. But Sykes doesn't like the fact that she washes clothes for white people. I'd like to point out Sykes' name. I don't know if Zora Neale did this deliberately, but there's a Sykes in Charles Dickens, spelled S-I-K-E-S, and David Copperfield, and he's very much like this character, a would-be murderer, and definitely a murderer in Dickens' case, and a real reprobate and a ragamuffin, rotten guy. This one is too, and he also doesn't work. So he looks down on Delia for being a washerwoman, this guy who doesn't work. And he's the opposite of Tea Cake, understand? I wanted to set that up so you know Zora loves men and also created one of the finest men and husbands you would ever want to meet. But it's not Sykes. Sykes is vicious. He beats her. He ridicules her. And he abuses her. And finally, he tries to kill her. He knows that she is afraid of snakes, so he brings one in. and he leaves it in a box in the house, and then he disappears. She comes in from church, which she loves, and she sees the snake. She bolts. This story is about dramatic irony, okay, and karma, because, of course, dumb Sykes walks back in to see if he's done his deed. He wants to marry old Bertha. He's having an affair with Bertha, plus she's got some money too. He's a sorry reprobate. And he walks in and the lights are out. This is poor people, okay? And he can't find any matches. I'm thinking that's good. And she's already bolted and she's in the chinaberry tree. I'm gonna take you over here. Flowers and trees are very, very important in Zora Neale Hurston. They are in Their Eyes Are Watching God, as well as a pear tree. It represents femininity and female sexuality. And she's in the chinaberry tree, and he's in the house, and he's come in to see if she's dead yet. And this is what happened. She mused at the tremendous whir inside, which every woodsman knows is one of the sound illusions. This is a rattlesnake, guys. The rattler is a ventriloquist. Just listen to Zora Neale Hurston. His whir sounds to the right, to the left, straight ahead, behind, close underfoot, everywhere but where it is. Woe to him who guesses wrong, unless he is prepared to hold up his end of the argument. Sometimes he strikes without rattling at all. Long before this, Sykes' ability to think had been flattened down to primitive instinct, and he leaped. That's where the snake is. I had to cut stuff onto the bed. This is karma. Orlando, with its doctors, was too far away. This is Delia thinking to herself, well, she can't do anything about it because the doctor's too far away anyway. She could scarcely reach the chinaberry tree where she waited in the growing heat, while inside she knew, and look at this image again, the cold river. That's venom, and the body going cold. The cold river was creeping up and up to extinguish, and the eye is swollen where he's already struck once. That eye which must now by know. The last three words of Zora Neale Hurston's story are that she knew. She knew that he put that snake in there. She knew he was trying to kill her. She was under no responsibility or obligation of going back in that house that he is begging her to come in and help him, because he knew that she was afraid of the snake. Why would she come back in? And he dies. By the way, the whole village was in support of her, but they didn't do anything to help her. The story is 1926. This is my favorite Zora Neale Hurston quote, and I'm going to have to talk fast now. Okay, and it's my favorite. I do not weep at the world. I am too busy sharpening my oyster knife. And if you've got an oyster knife, you are going to get that pearl. And so we have no evidence of her ever feeling sorry for herself. And again, this is a woman who knew about love. Love makes your soul crawl out from its hiding place. And that's what Tea Cake did for Janie. And then finally, a certain friend of mine has that plaque. And the last one, I'd like to remind folks, she was a researcher. She was a novelist and a short story writer and all this cool stuff, but she was also a researcher. And so this is on my students' assignments. Research is formalized curiosity. It is poking and prying with a purpose. And the alliteration is lovely. That's Zora Neale Hurston. Now you know who she is if you did not. I think everybody in the room has heard of Maya Angelou. She does not have degrees. And she came very poor in Stamps, Arkansas, etc. She doesn't have the college degree. She had pretty much high school education, and yet we call her Dr. Angelou. And she's the only person I know that without a doctorate, it's an honorary doctorate. She's got a pile of them. That I've called Dr. Angelou. She's done a heck of a lot more than I did for mine. And we call her Dr. Angelou because of the whole body of her work, besides which she did not get the Nobel Prize, and she should have. She was nominated for the Pulitzer. She should have gotten that. She did get the Grammy, and she got several other awards. In fact, a truckload of awards. All right, but she didn't get those two. But we call her Doctor because that's who she is. And this background tells you this is a Midwesterner and a Central East and essayist, poet, and she was a civil rights activist. She's famous for "I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings," and it's also been made into a teleplay, a television movie. It's pretty good, and it's a memoir, and that takes her up to age 17. All right, and she wrote many more. And then on the Pulse of Morning, I wanted to share this with you. Everybody loved Maya Angelou, and Bill Clinton loved Maya Angelou, and he asked her specifically to give a poetry reading, write her own poem and do a poetry reading at his first inauguration. She said, okay, that's done. And that is the now famous poem called On the Pulse of Morning, and it's a new day. But Phenomenal Woman is the one I want to share with you and have Maya read for you, okay? This is a signature poem as well, but I want to give you a couple of memes before I get to that point. My students love these, and she is a meme lady, just so quotable, and she gets turned into memes all over Twitter. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. Let that sink in. Okay? Because if you think something's a little bit off there, don't wait till it's off the second time. Walk. All right? And then this last one I love so much, and it's true. You've all been hurt. We've all been hurt. And usually, unfortunately, it's by somebody we love. Maybe a family member, maybe a dear friend, and we hurt each other, don't we? And I've always thought maybe we should be asking them for forgiveness rather than them forgiving us, okay? And she says, and this is so true, and I'd never thought about it till I saw it, I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did. Okay, we'll go there. But people will never forget how you made them feel. That you never get past that. Okay? Barack Obama, Maya Angelou Presidential Medal of Freedom. It's just a couple of years before she died. She's very emotional in this picture. The President of the United States kissing on her face. They were good friends. Okay? You have this poem, and she's going to read it for you here in a minute, but I wanted to set it up for you, and I think I'm going to make my time, Stevie. I wanted to share with you, and English teachers do this. It's called explication, from explication du texte in the French, and you do it in Bible class, right? You take the words apart. My students used to say, but Miss Samuelson, I don't want to take the words apart and leave them lying there. You put them back, okay? And you take the words apart and you look at the symbols and you also look at the structure, okay, of the sentences, etc. And if you look at Phenomenal Woman in front of you, and I hope, I brought as many as I had, about 50, so I hope everybody can look on while she reads it for you. I thought about reading it, and then let her read it, okay? Because what she does throughout this is put it all together. In the first stanza, it's very static, okay? And the second stanza is very dynamic, and it moves, and then it continues. And then she's drawing all the men in the room to her, because she's very confident, and they become the worker bees around the queen bee, and she's very proud of this, and she strides with confidence and power. And what we need to remember is what a phenomenon is. Because a phenomenon is something extraordinary, right? It's something extraordinary and it's something powerful, okay? If you are phenomenal, you are these things. But a phenomenon, the noun, is also something that suddenly appears. It just appears in the room, and it dominates the room, and it takes over everything. And this first part, and she'll start it again for you, she sets up, for the poem itself in the beginning, something that is the opposite of. She is going to deny being a part of this particular attitude toward women, and she's going to establish her own. Pretty women wonder where my secret lies. I'm not cute or built to suit a fashion model's size, but when I start to tell them, they think I'm telling lies. I say, it's in the reach of my arms, the span of my hips, the stride of my step, the curl of my lips. I'm a woman, phenomenal woman. That's me, Maya Angelou.
I'm Sam Dalvi. I'm an English professor, and I'm going to be talking about Toni Morrison and Alice Walker. But before I start that, I just wanted to introduce you a little bit to my journey, to how I came to love these Black women writers. I was about 18 or 19 in undergrad school, all the way in India, when we used to have to beg, borrow, steal books that were American, because it was hard to get copies of books by writers like Gloria Naylor. So when one of our professors would kindly say, hey, we have a book we got from the American Institute all the way, like 50 miles away, would you like it? And be like, yeah, please, anything that's not the regular books that we get to read. One of the first books I read was Gloria Naylor's The Women of Brewster Place. And of course, this has nothing to do with today. Maybe that's a future talk, John, wherever you are. So that was the first book I read. It's an amazing book. It's made up of short stories of different women who then come together to live in the same neighborhood. And it's a really easy read. So if you ever come across it, if you want to read something different, go for it. It's pretty easy to follow, and you'll love it. It's a very beautiful style. It's also a very short book, Women of Brewster Place. The second short book I read was Sula by Toni Morrison. Little did I know that about 10 years later, I would be writing a dissertation for my PhD, which would include Sula. I had no idea, obviously, back then. But this was the second book I read, and I was just blown away. The writing style, the characters, the people who were in the stories, the communities that were in the stories, their traditions, their language, their values were simultaneously similar to what I had experienced as an Indian young girl, but it was also completely different from the television and the movies that we sort of got the dribble down effect that we got on our TVs. So it was pretty amazing, and I wanted to not focus today on longer literature, because if you really want to get familiar with writers, the idea is to read shorter stuff by them and then sort of develop your way to longer stuff. Although these books are not long, so I would highly recommend them. And that brings us to Toni Morrison, who wrote Sula. One of the best way to introduce Toni Morrison is with this quote of hers: if there's a book that you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. Of course, for all of you who are probably English 1301, 1302 students are like, write? Ugh, I don't want to write anything but that. But as you grow and as you become better readers and better writers, think about that. If you don't like what you're reading, write it. That's the way to express yourself and to express your thoughts. But that's who Toni Morrison was. She wrote what she wanted to read. She was a legend, yeah, totally. She went to college at Howard University and at Cornell, taught at TSU, actually. I didn't know that until recently. State University of New York, Albany. She wrote her first book. She published her first book when she was 39 years old. I am 39. A lot of pressure when I read that every single time. I better get something done in the next few months. But that's, again, for you who feel like, it's too late for me. And if you're like 19, you're like, oh, I can't write, I can't do it. Yes, you can. If she can publish at the age of 39 and then go ahead and win a Pulitzer and a Nobel Prize, you can do it. So can I, right? Hopefully. She wrote Beloved, which is, again, another amazing novel. She won the Pulitzer for that, and in 1993, she won the Nobel Prize. So lots of accolades, and she is brilliant. Before we move into the story that I'm going to talk about, it is important for us to understand the values that Toni Morrison had and the basis on which she wrote the things that she wrote about. For her, race is not what we think race is. And I'm going to let her explain it. Let her talk, and then we will come to the story. So, when you hear that, it's pretty clear to you what she feels about the whole concept of racism. It's wrong of us to think that we are different races. We're not. We're ethnicities. We're different. We're from different places in the world, but we're not a different race. We're all the same race. And that brings me to my story, Recitatif by Toni Morrison. It is a short story, and just to let you know, if you are a 1302 student who is taking a class, the story is in this textbook. So if you want access to it, you don't have to Google it. It's right in the textbook. But you can Google it if you want to. You didn't hear it from me. This story is about two friends, Twyla and Roberta. Twyla is the one who's telling the story, so we hear it from her perspective. And they meet each other for the first time when they're about 8 or 9 years old because they're put in the same shelter for different reasons. Twyla's mother is a drunkard, probably. We get it in hints. And Roberta's mother is somebody who's sick all the time. So for different reasons, they get put in this shelter. They become friends. Then the story moves forward as they grow older and keep bumping into each other every once in a while and seeing how their lives change over several years. Right in the second paragraph, Morrison tells us that from Twyla's perspective, Roberta was a whole other race. That's all she says. We don't know which race is which girl. We're left with the mystery for the rest of the story. So the hints that she gives us are that Twyla says Roberta smelled funny. Allegedly, she's from the kind of people who never wash their hair. Roberta cannot read. She has big hair when Twyla meets her as a teenager. And at one point of time, Twyla looks at Roberta and thinks to herself, everything is just so easy for them. That's all we hear. Now, the hints that we get about Twyla are that her mother dresses in a way that embarrasses Twyla. She gets married to a middle-class family and moves to the suburbs. And she says to Roberta at one point of time, I hate it when you put your hands in my hair. And she supports desegregation. So one of the times that they meet, again, is when one of them is saying that we shouldn't segregate schools, and the other one is saying the opposite. So what happens throughout the story is the descriptions confuse you. You don't understand who is what. And we're used to the easy answers, right? We're used to somebody telling us, so she was black, this is how her hair was, this is what she looked like, this is how she talked, or she was white, and this is what she did, and this is what she looked like. Good literature, again, like I tell my students, will not give you those answers, and that's what Morrison does in this one. So this is the only short story she's ever published, and she said about the short story that the only short story I've ever written was an experiment in the removal of all racial codes from a narrative about two characters of different races for whom racial identity is crucial. So not only is it something that we impose upon others, it's also something that we sort of let our own identity be controlled by, right? Which is a problem. So that's the problem that she talks about. And one of the things to think about also is that it sort of messes with our brain because it makes us question what kind of stereotypes do you hold in your own head when you think about a person, when you approach a person. It makes you question your own beliefs. It makes you question your own priorities when you are trying to judge a person. So you question your own beliefs, which is interesting. So not only is she quizzing you about who are these characters, she's making you think about it, but she's also making you question your own stereotypes that you hold, because no two people will feel the same way at the end of the story. Wrapping up Toni Morrison, we're going to go towards Alice Walker. More of you may have heard of Alice Walker. Alice Walker's Color Purple than Alice Walker herself, because it's made into a Steven Spielberg Oscar-winning movie. But again, this was one of the first books I read, maybe the third or fourth book by an African-American female writer. Alice Walker had an eye injury early on in her life where she got hit by a bullet, like a BB gun bullet, that her brother was playing with. And you can see in this picture particularly that her right eye is slightly discolored. And because of that, she was very timid, very shy when she was growing up. And she took solace in writing and reading. And she became a writer very early on in her life. Color Purple is her third novel. She won the Pulitzer for it. And in her decades-long career, I think her last novel was published in 2017. So she's a very, very well-written author. Her story, the one that I'm going to discuss, is called To Hell with Dying. And this is one of her, I think this is her first published work, actually. And it was published by Langston Hughes in an anthology of short stories that featured up-and-coming Black writers in the 60s. And he had high praise for her. He said, neither you nor I have ever read a story like this before. And if you know a little bit about Langston Hughes, he was a difficult person to please. So he didn't like Zora Neale Hurston very much. So Alice Walker was one of the lucky ones. One of the things that Joan said, Dr. Samuelson said, was how men are portrayed in these works. And a criticism that all of these Black female writers faced was that you portray men very badly. You portray Black men very poorly. And you shouldn't do that because that reflects badly on us. But there's lovely characters in all of these works. And the male character in To Hell with Dying is one of the most sweetest. Ironically, his name, not ironically, but funny, I'm sure she means to do it. His name is Mr. Sweet. And he's a neighbor of the protagonist, the unnamed protagonist. And he's just a lovable guy. And the whole story revolves around how the protagonist and her family's responsibility of the kids is to go over to Mr. Sweet's house every time he goes through an episode of quote-unquote dying. And the father would generally walk into his deathbed and say, to hell with dying, man. And these kids would jump over him and kiss him and tickle him until he would quote-unquote be revived. And that's the whole story. And it's so endearing and it's so loving and so, for the lack of a better term, sweet, that it makes you realize that there's no one kind of writing that these women do. They write about all kinds of things. And this is a story that is just a wonderful, sweet story. This cover is actually a children's book that was made into, the story was made into a children's book, and that's the cover for that. It's just a delightful little story. And you'd think, the point to think about is that Alice Walker would then continue to write about communities. And Joan also talked about how there's a community and there's people who help each other, who nurture each other, and who take care of each other. And that's the story of To Hell with Dying, about how, people come together and they look after one another. And that's an important trope that will play again and again in her works later. So at the end of To Hell with Dying, the narrator has grown up, she's gone off to get her PhD, she's getting her doctorate degree, and she gets that final call from her parents saying that Mr. Sweet is dying, you better come back. She leaves everything, jumps on a plane, drives for a few hours, gets to their house and realizes that this time it's not gonna work. No kisses are going to work, no hugs are going to work. And she stays with him until he dies, and she finds out later that the guitar that she had grown up watching him play this guitar, he has left her that guitar. So he also knew that he's probably going to die. He prepared for it. And he left that guitar for her, and she picks it up. She strums a few words from the song that he used to sing to her, making us wonder whether art is what saves us, right? It's not just that it's all of these other things too, community and love and friendship and brotherhood, but it's also art. It comes back to that crucial question. And it is art that has saved, people like Joan and people like me, and it's these women that have saved us. So that's our talk for today, and hopefully they will save you too when you need them. Thank you.
Be sure to follow us on social media at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Like this video, leave a comment, and hit that subscribe button to be notified about our latest content.